Today's Gemara Megillah Daf Chof Dalit. All the learning for today's shir should be as Choshev Yisochaim the version Mir Rasi. It's a dish Shain Lesser was Shain Makal Mordechai was Avshenda Sikut was Avshendo Shema ben Chaya Shlomo ben Levi Zava. They should all find their shidduch bekarev mamish. Well, this chos and fuah shleimus shlias ben Yefeder Rafal Avram ben Rochel Hoidoya Shimshon ben Chana Abigail Peril Bas Esther and men ben Vega Chaim and Sarj Lom Zidum Reis the service Knan Zid Basim Chaysay Yisrael ben Minzel Ezeret Shalei Shom Zaviv Shaviv Shachan Shmol Batila Tzim Chan Reis Chay Bazina Dina Veshendina Svi Veger Pivkos Hashem Tzasim Echlaster B'Sayir Shar Chayli Yisrael. We pick it up on the very bottom of Chof Gimel Amid Beis after the Mishnah, beginning today's shir with a new Mishnah. Ha Kairi Ba Taira Lo Yivchayz Mishlei Psukim. So when that reads in the Torah, it's never let him read less than 3 psukim. And he may not read more than 1 pasuk for the meturgaman, for the translator. Meaning, he has to pause after each pasuk. He reads in entirety, minimum 3 psukim, and after each pasuk, he pauses to let the interpreter, the meturgaman, translate that pasuk. And we turn over to Chavdal and Aleph. Navi, when it comes to the Navi, Shleisha, when it comes to Navi, he can read 3 psukim and let the meturgaman translate 3 psukim. What's the reason? So Rashi in the top line speaks out, because when it comes to Navi, there's no Hayrah, there's no Psak Halacha you're learning from the Navi, so it's okay if maybe a minor nuance is missed in translation. Whereas when it comes to Torah, that there's the mitzvah, that there's the Hayrah, then you have to read each pasuk with each pasuk translated. Says the Mishnah further, if the 3 psukim from Navi are from 3 separate paragraphs, then Kairin Echad, each one is read one by one, and then the Meturgaman translates. Medalgin ba Navi ve Medalgin ba Torah. We're allowed to skip from one section of Navi to another section of Navi, as we know commonly happens in the Haftarahs. We'll read from part here, then we'll read from part there. That is allowed, but in Torah that is not allowed. Vadkamu Medalgin, how much you let us skip in the Navi? Kadesh Yifsek and Meturgaman until the point that the Turgman would have to pause. And Rashi points out what this means is the amount of time it takes to roll it, that the Meturgaman would be able to translate in that amount of time. Meaning, as the Meturgaman is translating, you'll be able to roll it that amount, that small section. That is how much you are allowed to roll. That is how much you're allowed to skip. So says the Mishnah, first beginning with says the Gemara, in Chavdal and Aleph, Hani Gimel Psukim Keneged Mi, Amar Avasi Keneged Torah Neviim and Iksuvim. Keneged Torah Neviim and Iksuvim. And now the next part of the Mishnah, and this din obviously we saw yesterday, we also saw it's Keneged Kind of Leviim and Yisraelim. Says the Gemara of Likra Meturgaman Yaisvi Pasuk Echad. And you have to pause after each pasuk to let the translator translate. Uba Navi Gimel Psukim, but in Navi you can do 3 psukim at a time. But if the 3 psukim in Navi are 3 separate parashas, 3 separate paragraphs, says the Gemara, keep going. What is an example of a paragraph being 1 pasuk in Navi that would have to be read and translated one by one? So we see that there's 3 different sections, 3 different topics that are discussed back to back, and these would be ones that one would have to pause and let the translator translate between each and every one. Says the Gemara, Medalgin Menavi Medalgin Batayra. We skip a Navi not in Torah very many. Asks the Gemara once again, Kairi Achrei Mois. And as Rashi points out, this is the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. As we learned in Yuma, the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur would read first from Achrei Mois, and then he would read Vachma Sarvaka Medali. How is he allowed to do that? Asked the Gemara. He's skipping. Amar Abaye like Kasha Kambachleish Yivsagat Turgman Kambachleish Yivsagat Turgaman. Says Abaye, not a problem, because one is a short skip. A short skip is allowed. A long skip is not allowed. Ask the Gemara 1 second. Valakatani Medagim Banavi Vemedagim Batayra Vadkamu Medagim Navi Akadesh Yivsagat Turgaman. And the Mishnah clearly implies, says the Gemara, Mechlal to Bitayra Klal Klalai. The obvious implication, which I'm sure was bothering everyone when you read the Mishnah, it's clearly not like the Gemara, because the Mishnah is clearly teaching us that amount to skip, the amount that the Turgman could translate, as we quoted the Rashi at the end of the Mishnah, the amount that you could read in the Sefer, that's the Din in Navi, not in Torah. So how can the Kohen Gadol read in Yom Kippur and skip, even if it is a small skip? Elo Amar Abaye explains Abaye like Kasha. Kan binyan echad Kan Bishnei Inyanis. That when it's within one Inyan, that's when the Mishnah in Yuma is discussing the Kohen Gadol is allowed to skip. When it's Shnei Inyanis, that's when the Mishnah says you're not allowed to skip. V'atanya, and very important, as we look in Rashi says B'nichusa. Rashi is always keying in that generally V'atanya is a word that connotes a kasha, a question. V'atanya, asks the Gemara. Rashi says no. B'nichusa, this V'atanya is a raya. Says the Gemara B'nichusa, you read it gently. Explains the Gemara about Tanya Medalgin B'Atayra Binyan Echad. You're allowed to skip in Torah one in. You do Manavi V'Shtein Yanim, like we just said. Kan bekan, and each skip but also always, even when it's in one Indian in Torah, it can never be more that the Metargumon is going to have to wait. Tani idach, another brayse in medagim menavi lenavi you menavi shel shnei masar medali gmuvach yilog misayv asayfer litzchilasai. Again, just another din that when it comes to skipping in navi, it can't be from beginning to end. So we're concluding that even though the Mishnah perhaps connoted and implied and was medayik that you cannot skip at all in Torah, the Gemara is concluding, no, that is not true. You could skip in Torah, you just have to skip within one Inyan. When it comes to Navi, you're allowed to skip two Inyanim, two topics, but even in Navi, it cannot be a large skip. Says the Mishnah on the bottom of Chavdalad Amid Aleph. Hamaftir ba Navi upayris al Shema. The one that says the Haftarah in the Navi, he is the one that is Peiris literally divides the Shema, which we saw yesterday meant that when someone comes late to Minyan and they miss Shema, what they would do is they would say Baruch Hu, they would say the first bracha of Kaddish, the first bracha of Shema, and then Shema. Again, as we pointed out, a practice which is not necessarily done nowadays, but says the Gemara. Yes, says the Gemara. So one that does the Attire, he's one that's Peiris says Shema, and and he davens when they say Chazar Sashatz Beishman Esrei, Vunoisias Kabov, Yidochen, Zemayakotan. But if he's a child and he's not allowed to do those things, his father or his Rebbe goes on his behalf. Now the Mishnah continues, part number 2. Katan kairei ba Torah u'metargim. But Katan is allowed to read Torah and Sibur, and he's allowed to be the Meturgman and be the translator. Avol ein paris al Shema. He cannot divide the Shema. Ve'inoi v'lefnei ativ. He can't down for the Amid. Ve'inoi says kabav. He cannot dochen. Poicheach. That's part number 2 of the Mishnah, is dealing with a Katan. Part number 3 in the Mishnah is dealing with someone that is dressed inappropriately for tefillah. Paicheach, literally Rashi learns, it means that his legs are exposed. Other Rishonim learn that other parts of his body are exposed. Says the Mishnah, Pairis says Shema is allowed to divide the Shema, Metargim is allowed to be the interpreter. Avol einoi kair b'Torah, you can't read in the Torah, ve'ino iver l'bnei ateva, you can't down for the Amid, ve'ino noisi eskabov, you cannot dochen. And now the fourth part of the Mishnah concludes, Suma, a blind person, Pairis says Shema, could be the one to divide the Shema, Umetargim, and he can translate. Rav Yudaimer, Kol Rama, Iris Miyamav, says there's 2 types of blind people. If you're blind, then, God forbid, not you. If one became blind later in life, that's one thing. But says Rav Yud, if you were always blind, then Einoi Pairis says Shema, then you're not allowed to be dividing the Shema, which we will see in the Gemara more. Just one Rashi about 8 lines to the bottom points out that the reason why Peiris Shema is a higher level chiyuv is because there's a bracha that you have to say. So says the Gemara, let's go dissect the Mishnah piece by piece. My time, the first part of the Mishnah said that the maftir, the one does the Attire, he gets extra kibudim, he davens v'amad, he's one that dochas, etc. Why? Rav Papa Amar, 6 lines to the bottom of Chavdalad Amar Aleph says Rav Papa, Kavod. The reason is to give him kavod. And Rashi speaks out, what does that mean? Because he was the one that took a position that's not having kavod of Attire. We give him extra kavod by allowing him to do the practices in the Mishnah. Rabbi Bar Simi Amar, another reason, because we don't want people to come to fight. As Rashi points out, Hadavar Bali de Machlekes, Ani Maftir, Hatadavar Levnei Ateva, I got Maftir, and you're davening for the Amud. So 2 different reasons: either we give it to the person who does Attire because to give him kavod, or to prevent fighting. Which, of course, we see that fighting in shul is not a new thing. But says the Gemara, what is the practical difference between Rav Papa and Rabbi Bar Simi, between saying that the reason we're giving to the one that got the Attire is because of kavod, or the reason is to prevent fighting? Says the Gemara, the nafkamina Meaning the practical ramification is when one davens for the Amud for free. In such a scenario, according to the second answer of Rabbi Barsimi, since it's a job that is for free, therefore we're not afraid there's going to be a fight because it's a non-paying job. But according to Rabbi, it's still a job of kavod, so we'll give it to the one that does maftir. Says the Gemara Tanan, we learned in our Mishnah, and this is going to be a kasha on the second answer of Rabbi Arsimi on the fact that we come to fight. Tanan, it said in the Mishnah, if the katan is one that got the Attire, then the father or the Rebbe is the one that takes his place in Damas Laman, etc. Asks the Gemara, if you're going to tell me that the reason, the impetus to give the extra items to the one that does the Attire is because we're afraid of fighting, Kata Barney to you, are we really afraid that a katan is going to fight? That can't be the reason. Elamai, says the Gemara back, Misham Kavod, 1 second. Katan bar kavanu, is there kavod that you could give to the katan? Answers the Gemara, Eli could kavod up if a kavod rabbi. You're right. The kid himself doesn't get honor, but you know who gets honor? The father or the Rebbe is the one that gets the honor. And similarly, as we turn over to Chavdal and Mabeis, Hachanami can Nitsuyi Aviv and Nitsuyi Rabbi, the father or the Rebbe can fight in his behalf, and that is the reason why it's not a kasha, and the two answers of the Gemara stand, the answer of Rabba of Kavod and Rabba Rasimi, because we're afraid of fighting. And now we continue on Chavbeis and Beis, the next part of the Mishnah, Beicheach, where he says Shema, one who has his legs exposed, one who's not dressed properly, he's allowed to read the Shema, but can't do other things. What do we have? Two things coincide. We have a katan, and he's a Beicheach, his legs are exposed. Is he allowed to read in the Torah? Now, what is the Havamina? Why would it be better if he's a katan? So Rashi over here at the top points out that we think right now that the reason, the issue is of erva, and the katan perhaps does not have a din of erva. A katan is younger, so maybe a katan, even though part of his body is exposed, we'd be more lenient. That is how Rashi explains the Gemara. Again, other Rishonim that learn Peicheach differently, they explain this Gemara differently. But says the Gemara 4 lines down, Amra lei b'tibay l'cha arum. Why don't you just ask if the kid is naked, if he's not dressed at all? Why are you asking only if he's partially undressed? Responds the Gemara, Aram my time misham kavod tzibur. You know why I didn't ask you about Aram? Because kavod tzibur. It's ridiculous to think they can have someone completely undressed in front of the tzibur. Achanami, says the Gemara, misham kavod tzibur. It's the same reason, and therefore we would not allow even a katan whose legs are exposed to be any part of the davening, etc., aside from the part that says Shema. Suma part says Shema. We continue in the Gemara 6 lines down that a blind person could indeed be the one to split the Shema. Tanya, we learned in a Brisa. Many people wanted to darshan the Ma'aser Merkava, the story of the chariot in Yechezkel going up to the Kisi HaKavod, and yet they never saw it in their life. So what do we see? Asked the Gemara. We see that without actually seeing something, it's possible to comprehend it. So ask the Gemara and Rav Yehuda, even one who, God forbid, is born blind, he should be allowed to say the bracha of Shema. Of course, the issue here is, what is the first bracha of Shema? You're making a bracha that Hashem created the light, created the luminaries. And if you're born blind, if Yehuda says you don't have that benefit, how can you make that bracha? But ask the Gemara, we see clearly you can comprehend in seichel, in das, in mind. It's possible to comprehend without actually seeing something, just like one would comprehend at some level of Ma'aser Merkava, the chariots traveling up to the Kisi HaKavod. Responds the Gemara of Rabbi Yehuda, Hasan ba'avnasa deleka talia milsa. Over there by the Ma'aser Merkava, it's ba'avnasa, it's on understanding. The liba talia milsa, it's dependent in your understanding, your leib, your heart, or I should say better, in your mind. In your Ba'avnata delivata yamilsa, in your mind. Therefore, so you think about it, you delve into the matter, and you could comprehend it. But over here the brachas on the luminaries and the light, it's on the benefit that one gets, and that is not something that one gets without actually seeing in his life. And therefore, says the Gemara, there would not to be able to make that bracha. Says the Gemara back, what about the Rabbanan? For Rabbanan is le'ana, and the Rabbanan say, no, you do have ana. Rav Yosi. How do you have an eye? You're blind. Says the Gemara, like Rav Yosi taught us, the Tanya Rav Yosi Kol Yama Yisi Mitztayer Al Mikrazet. My entire life I didn't understand the following pasuk that says, V'Yisi pasuk in Devarim Mimashmish B'Zarayim K'Sheyimashmish Iver Ba'Afela. And you're going to feel around in the dark like a blind man feels around in the dark. And Rav Yosi was always bothered, explains the Gemara. If he's blind, who cares if it's light or dark? What does it mean like a blind man in the dark? He's blind, it doesn't make a difference to him. Rav Yosi explains that one time I had the following story happen to me. Of course, always a Maisa brings out the strongest. One time Malach was walking in the darkness of the night, and I saw a blind person walking the road. He's blind. Maybe one hand he has the walking stick, the other hand he's holding a torch. I said to him, I said to him, my child, why do you need this torch? Amar Ali explains, calls the man Shavuka biyadi b'nei Adam rayin oisiu matzilin oisim and avachasim and akisim and barkanim. As long as I have a avuka, the torch, other people will be my eyes. They will see me and they will save me from the ditches, the thorns, and other issues. And therefore says Rav Yosi, that's why the Chachamim held you're allowed to make a bracha one who's blind even his entire life, and he never had benefit. He still can make a bracha yitzar. You know why? Because he gives him benefit. The fact that other people could see and they could help him. And now we continue in the Mishnah, in the wide lines of Chavdalat and Beis, Koyin Shish Biyada movement. Now we get into halachas of Birchas Kohanim. A kohen that his hand is blemished, like he says, Kapav, he's not allowed to dochin. Rav Yehuda Omer Misha Yadav Sivu Ois, even if his hands are colored with what? With satis, with a type of, it's called woad, a type of dye, similar to Techelis, explains Rashi, then you cannot dochin. Lo says Kapav, because everyone stares at your hands. Of course, everyone's wondering, but the kohen's hands are covered. Okay, this is all one big revolving circle. You can't look at his hands because it's like kana. He covers his hands, so you don't look at them. But there is always this potential issue. We don't want to draw attention to the hands of the kohen, and that would be the issue if there's a mum or colored, etc. Said the Gemara, Tana Mumin Sha'amru Mipeh Befanav Yadav Viraglav. These women that we're discussing are on his fanav, his face, Yadav and Raglav. Amar Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Yadav Bo Hakniyais. If his hands are Bo Hakniyais, his hands are spotted, Lehi says Kapav. Tanam Yachis, similar Rice Yadav Bukanos, Lehi says Kapav. Akumais Akushais. If his hands are bent forwards or they're bent to the side, Lehi says Kapav. Amar Ravasi explains Ravasi. Chifni, like he says, Kapnov. Says Rav Ashi, if someone is Chifni, if he's from a place called Haifa, then he cannot dochin. Tanam Yachim, or even there, David lo Anshe Beis, Sham lo Anshe Beis, Haifa. Why not? Lo Anshe Tevainim and not people from the place called Tevainim. Why? And they shekar the Alphin, Ein Alphin, they mispronounce the letters of the Aleph Beis, and Yoyer Hashem Panav Elecha, they're going to pronounce it correctly with the Ayin at the Aleph, and that is the reason why he cannot dochin. Of course, a bit difficult nowadays, many of us do not have much of a difference in our Havar of Ayin and Aleph, but of course there is a real difference. Amrli Rav Chiyah Rav Shimon bar Rebbe El Moli Ato Levi Pasal Ato Min Adochin. So Rav Chiyah besides Rav Shimon bar Rebbe, if you were a Levi, you would be. If you were a Levi, you would be puzzled from Duchning. This is referring to the Duchin, meaning the Levium singing on the platform in the Beis HaMikdash. Why? Because your voice is heavy, and that is a mum for a Levi. Also, Amar Leila Avua, Kali. So Shimon told his father, and Amalei, no, you should go tell him. You know, you should tell Rav Chiyah, when you get to the person, I'm Mekavel Hashem, Chakisi Hashem, I hope to Hashem. If you do not find anyone to help you, you should tell him that is not the right way to talk, and part of the reason is because he said the word chakisi, he would mispronounce the ches and the hey, and it would sound like hakisi, that you're hitting Hashem, and that's what he told him. What? You did it incorrect. Amr Avuna says Ravuna Zavligon. He says Kapav. Zavligon is a kohen with very teary eyes. He cannot dochin. Ask the Gemara 1 second. He said Ravuna. There was one in the neighborhood of Ravuna. Vavibar is Yadeh, and he would dochin even though he had teary eyes. Ravuna didn't say anything. Says the Gemara, no, he lived in the city, and therefore what? People were familiar with his deformity, people were familiar with his eyes always tearing, and therefore we're not worried people are going to come stare at him. That is why it is permissible. If a similar price says, then it is mutter. Ask the Gemara 1 second. Excuse me, the Avibar is Yadeh. There was a one that was blind to one eye, and he took it. Answers the Gemara. He lived there, and everyone knew. Again, because the issue here is we don't want people staring and gazing at the Gayanim, and therefore, if he lives in the city and everyone knows what he looks like, it is no problem. Now we conclude the Mishnah with Rav Yehuda Aimer Misha Yadav Sevu. He says Kabbal's answer died. Taught learned to the Mishnah. Mutter. If it's a whole city of painters, a whole city that works with dye, and therefore the fact that his hands are all blue and dyed is not abnormal, and everyone looks that way, then it's not an issue. And therefore you would be allowed to dochin. And let's just start the Mishnah. Says the Mishnah. If someone says, I'm not going to daven, am I wearing colored clothing? We don't even let him daven in white clothing. I think Gemara will explain. If he says they won't daven in sandals, we don't let him daven even barefoot. Sakana. If you make your tefillin rounded, it's sakana. You can push into that. If anybody misses, you don't get a mitzvah. Nosnal mitzvah. If you put tefillin on your forehead, oyal bas yadai on your palm, harisa derech minas. That is abikarsis. Sivan zav and nosnal base unkeli. If you cover the tefillin with gold, or you put on the sleeve, shaloi of your sleeve, harisa derech chatzion achitzonim. This is the way of haughty people, and you should not do that. Says the Gemara, Ma'itaima. What's the reason? That if you said I'm not going to daven in colored clothing, we don't even let you daven in white clothing. Chayshima, it says Gemara, Chayshin and Shema Minos Nizrika boy. Perhaps he's a man, perhaps he's a heretic, and therefore we don't let him daven. And Rashi points out over here because the minim would daven in non-colored clothing. So if he says, I'm not going to daven in colored clothing, and similarly, I'm not going to wear sandals, we're worried, wait, maybe this guy's a min, and therefore we don't even let him daven if he's not wearing those entities. And we'll conclude with the Gemara that says, says the Gemara 2 lines to the bottom, if you're tefillin the need to be square, and says Rabbah, not only do they have to be square, but rather the stitching and the diagonal, that is also a halacha l'Moshe misinai. Amar Abba Masiz Davida ki amzuga. So says the Gemara 1 second, but our Mishnah seemingly imply that it's okay if it's not square. So Rav Papa explained Masiz Davida ki amguza. It was made round like a nut or an egg, and therefore, there is no reason we could learn from the Mishnah to anything in the Brisa that the tefillin must be square. And that's what we're going to conclude over here. Again, just this last detail, the Mishnah is saying that it was a kasha. Why did the Mishnah say that the tefillin can't be round? And the Brisa seemingly said the same thing, it has to be square. So the Gemara is answering the fact that the Mishnah said it can't be round does not necessarily teach us it has to be square. We'll pick it up for the next Mishnah, dealing with Berachas Kahanim in the next year. Hashem.